The London Free Press podcast returning for another week and another new episode, and we are focusing on the biggest and most important stories in London and the surrounding area. And who better to do that with than London Free Press reporter, award-winning London Free Press reporter, many awards. Randy Richmond joins us on the podcast today. Randy, thank you very much for doing this with us. We appreciate it.
Oh, my pleasure.
Something you're working on right now, and a piece about this ran on lfpress.com last week, and there's another one that came out this week about it, would be a hearing for a former London police officer who is fighting criminal convictions. There are a few stories like this, obviously, that happen from time to time, but this one's particularly interesting for a few reasons. Tell us more about this story and what you're working on here.
Sure. This case involves a retired ex-constable, Achille Corrado, who left the force earlier this year. He was charged with releasing confidential information and trying to influence the release of a prisoner from the police station. And in the last fall, 2019, he acknowledged that he did those things, but he pleaded not guilty because his intentions were honorable. He believed that he was actually working to break open a ring of corrupt police officials and criminals in southwestern southern Ontario. He was being led along this path by a man that we now know as Darko Jovanovic, who had just recently been convicted of trying to defraud Windsor people by pretending to be a pediatric neurosurgeon. So an accomplished and convicted con artist. He meets up with Achille Corrado. He convinces this officer that there's corruption in the force and convinces him to release information. So, the trial goes on. He pleads not guilty for that reason, but the judge finds him guilty. But even before the trial began, there were some motions by Corrado's defense lawyers to adjourn things because they believed there were some missing police files in the disclosure the Crown gave them. So lo and behold, in February of this year, the judge granted Corrado and his defense team an abusive process hearing. And that's the hearing I'm at this week. And that involves whether or not basically Corrado was treated fairly by London police. Two elements to that we can talk about more. One element is, did he get all the information he was supposed to get from police? And second, and kind of the bigger question is, can London police, is there a conflict of interest when London police investigate one of their own?
And that's a good question. That speaks to the piece that you wrote last week, and you had someone tell you, investigate to clear was the what was the phrase that was used. We'll talk about that in just a second. But as we learn more about what happened here, and as we get more into this hearing that you've been following this week, are we getting deeper into what has occurred here? Are we finding out more about it? So what have we heard so far?
Well, what we've heard so far today is sort of the Achille Corrado's lawyer has sort of mapped out what he's going to do. He has questioned how the police extracted the data from Corrado's phone. That was interesting. It's got a bit technical, but basically they sent it off to a company that does this kind of thing as a specialty. They did not click the box that says get all the data off. So they got this back and they sent it off to the defense lawyers, and the defense lawyers, Corrado himself, said, that seems to be something missing here. Turns out there were. They hired an expert who went back and found out that they had this unclicked box on their online order form, I guess you want to call it. So that was one of the problems. The disclosure wasn't complete. There was also some talk about how a phone seized, Corrado's phone was seized, of course, and Darko Jovanovic's phone was seized. And they were supposed to be turned off once the police seized them, but there was evidence that they'd been turned on. Any of these things could be nefarious or not nefarious. We don't know. And that was another point today, is that there's no way of telling, there's no way of telling intent, and there's no way even of telling if anything got damaged or changed when they were on. So that's kind of the technical part about, there's missing files. There's going to be questions. I think the judge is going to will consider, from the sounds of the arguments, the judge is going to consider whether there was sort of this malicious intent to do this. I think the bigger question, and what the defense lawyer was saying today, was there's a conflict of interest, because although the Ontario Provincial Police kind of oversaw this investigation, the real legwork was done by London Police. And so that's, he says, is a conflict of interest. That's interesting, because I'm not sure it's ever been raised in court before that police investigating themselves is a conflict and therefore an abusive process.
Now, in a lot of cases, when it involves the death or injury of a civilian, we have the Special Investigations Unit that investigates, but this is not one of those. The SIU is not part of this. So tell us more about police investigating yourselves. You mentioned this has not been brought up in a courtroom before, and I know that you've talked to experts who have said, yeah, this may be something to be concerned about.
Right. Yeah. We talked to some experts about this, including 2 former police officers. One was involved in the giant corruption probe in Toronto about 2008 or so. He was an internal investigator, so he knows this stuff firsthand. And he talked about what you mentioned. He talked about that investigate to clear. That's kind of when you get the order from on high, or if you're an investigator for internal affairs or for your professional standards branch, he says sometimes you can get a little, nudge from above saying, this is an investigate to clear. In other words, do your work, but the result will be that this guy gets cleared, or a woman. And on the other hand, he says there can also say, the people from above can say, we don't like this person. They're a pain, so throw everything you got at them. And so, the other experts, the experts are saying there's a bias built, there can be a bias built in. Everybody's biased, right? Mm-hmm. So you've been working with someone for 10, 20 years, and you get a chance to get rid of them. Some chiefs might do that. So there's this pressure from above that can go either way, to either clear the person or throw the book at them. So that sort of presents this conflict of interest, and that raises a question among these experts and others: is why would you ever have your own police force investigate their own officers? So across Canada, we did a bit of a survey for the story about what other police forces do. A lot do exactly what London does. It's up to the chief's discretion to decide where it goes, aside from SIU cases, of course. Some other ones, though, Victoria, for example, they go automatically to a different force. And Quebec looks like it's the same thing. They automatically to a different police force, regardless of, the chief doesn't have the discretion to determine who does that. So there's models out there where other forces, police forces do it, police departments do it. Some of the experts and advocates we talked to said, yeah, that's okay, but why don't we just have sort of a separate thing altogether for internal affairs, which oddly enough Chicago has, and it sounds like it's its own entity, own ability, answers to no one, and basically, investigates when officers are accused of criminal wrongdoing.
Yeah, that's a very interesting part of this, just because, look, there's been a lot of talk, especially recently, about accountability for police. And can we have full accountability for police if it is the phrase police investigating police? And again, doesn't always turn out this way as far as let's make sure this particular person gets clear. But you're right, there could be some biases there. So interesting that we're having a conversation about this in the courtroom right now, because obviously if this becomes something that defense teams can rely on, or whatever it happens to be, that, hey, maybe we shouldn't have police investigating police. It's just a matter of time until you would think the system's going to get changed, right?
You would think so. I mean, and you mentioned it. It's basically one person's decision all the time. You're relying on the honor of a police chief, which maybe a thing you can rely on a lot. You may have a good chief one year and a bad one the next, but we're always coming down to one person's decision on important matters. So this abusive process hearing could speak to future hearings. So far, what we've seen at the Free Press is some sort of civil lawsuit action, where that's been the only sort of redress so far. We saw that earlier this year when we broke a story about a constable Sladek who was suing the police force, his own colleagues. Again, he was a London police officer. Still is one, and he is suing his own force and some of his colleagues because of an investigation that a court hearing actually ruled was not complete at best and led to charges against him. he was acquitted of those charges, and now he's turning around and suing the police department. So, whether you whether you trust the current administration or not, it gets messy when you are investigating your own people. It just seems to be common sense to many people, that, it's the same thing when there's harassment cases, and that school boards and institutions will go to an outside investigator. Their own internal ones are often suspect. You just don't do that anymore. If you want accountability, you have to have someone outside the department to do the investigations.
Yeah, and I would hope that's where we wind up going with this. No matter what you think of this case, I think there are cases where perhaps having more than one person who happens to be the chief of police being involved in it is probably a good thing when it comes to the decision process here. So on the subject of this particular case, how much more is there to hear as far as this particular hearing goes? Is it going to be the rest of the week, couple of days? What are we looking at here, and what kind of results are possible here?
Well, they're looking to have this hearing continue all week long. So a 5-day hearing has been set aside for it. We're going to hear during this hearing from the London police officer, Cam Halliday, who was part of the investigation. I believe he'll be on soon this week. And, I'm not really sure where it will go from there. I mean, the judge in this case, who oversaw Achille Corrado's trial, is he's a very sharp judge. He's can be crusty, but for both sides. And I was surprised, to tell you the truth, after watching the trial, that he allowed an abusive process hearing, because he certainly didn't seem like he was going to when the argument was first raised. So it's really hard to tell where this is going to go or what the result will be. And to be honest, I'm not sure what sort of precedents are set. It's certainly a good question that we should follow up if indeed there's a decision that says, one way or the other, we shouldn't be doing this. So, it's interesting. The people I talk to, the experts and advocates, are watching this too, because as I say, they've never seen such a thing, an abusive process hearing for this kind of thing. So they're watching it closely. And if nothing else, even a judge's comment saying this is messy will be enough to give them some ammunition in their battles to make things more transparent and accountable.
Before we wrap up here, Randy, what's on the line here for former Constable Corrado?
Well, his conviction could be stayed if this goes the way he wants, and that would obviously mean a lot to him and his his future.
Sure.
Yeah. So I think he's got a lot on the line here. He has maintained all along that he was conned by a clever individual. He lost a lot of money himself by being told to protect this individual and help him in any way possible. So, he's already lost a lot. This would regain, I think, some measure of respect in his community, and, show that perhaps he was, perhaps he was the victim of a system, not necessarily a police department, a victim of a system that, shouldn't be investigating officers the way that is.
Yeah. And maybe, as he said, he was just trying to do the right thing and wound up not doing the right thing. It's a very, very interesting case. We'll keep watching it the rest of the week for sure. Randy, anything else you want to add on this quickly before I wrap up?
No, that's great. That's great, Craig. And again, I think that the point that we're trying to make at the Free Press is not necessarily the officers involved were doing the right thing or the wrong thing, either the investigating ones or the ones who are accused, but that, again, we like to say that it's this, we think a system needs to be changed. We're not casting aspersions on any officers or chiefs here. We just don't think, we just question, and, it's Free Press questioning through experts. Is this the right thing to do?
Yeah. It's not a problem with the particular players. It's a problem with the game, to use that that analogy. We'll leave it there. Randy, thank you so much for joining the London Free Press podcast today.
You're welcome.
That's London Free Press reporter Randy Richmond. You can read the latest that Randy's written on lfpress.com about this ongoing hearing involving an ex-London police officer who's fighting his criminal convictions. If you want to subscribe to this podcast, I highly suggest you do so. You can do so on Spotify. You can do so on Apple Podcast, Google Podcast, or Stitcher as well. Plus, you can follow us on YouTube, or of course, look out for episodes on lfpress.com. Thanks again to Randy Richmond for being part of the podcast on this episode. Hopefully you can join us next time right here on the London Free Press Podcast.